I've seen more deadly creatures in a spaceport's trash bin. Kel was alone when he first made the comment, but in a few seconds, the entire bridge crew turned to stare at him. Most of them were veterans, galactic warlords and mercenaries. There were no rookies here. They had seen carnage across the stars, every kind of warfare imaginable. But when Kel, the human intelligence officer assigned to the ranks of the Kexian coalition, said that, they knew he was serious. "Explain yourself, Kel," General Tran growled. His voice was low, reptilian, like a swamp creature's hiss. His eyes were narrowed slits. "I mean it," Kel replied, his voice casual as he stared out the bridge's viewing window, watching the wreckage of a recently destroyed enemy fleet float in the distance. The Terran have this peculiar trait. It's not just their ability to adapt. No. It's something more unpredictable. A ferocity no one seems to fully understand. Tran snorted. "And that's supposed to be impressive? We fought with races that can wipe out entire continents with a thought. Some of us," he jabbed a clawed finger at his chest, "can rip the hearts out of our enemies with our bare hands. But a Terran soldier? He can't even breathe in the atmosphere of our homeworld without a suit." "That's the thing," Kel said, his tone softer now, more measured. "They're not the strongest. They're not the smartest. They aren't even the most advanced in terms of technology. What they have, though, is something you can't replicate." He paused, glancing at the silent crew. The tension in the room thickened. "The most terrifying thing about human armies in war is how they never stop." General Tran scoffed again, but his lips trembled slightly. The others on the bridge exchanged uneasy glances. They had fought humans before, sure, but not like this. "There's an old Terran saying," Kel went on, leaning against the console in front of him. "It goes, if you're going through hell, keep going. The meaning is simple. No matter how bad things get, a human soldier will push forward until he dies or the war ends." The general blinked slowly. "That's just ridiculous." "They're not invincible," Kel smirked. "No, they're not. They've got more weaknesses than any other race in the galaxy. They need food, water, rest. Then what's so special about them?" The general interrupted, his claws tapping rhythmically on the metal of his command seat. "It's their mentality." Kel stood up straight, turning to face the group. "Humans don't know how to quit. It's not in their nature. When you kill one of them, there's always another, and another after that. And when you think you've killed them all, you'll find out you've only been fighting their children, their cousins, their neighbors, their entire species. They're like cockroaches but harder to squash, and they fight for each other like nothing else." "I think you've been drinking too much Terran whiskey," Tran sneered. "I've seen your reports. Your brave Terran died in droves against superior forces." "Sure. Some of them do," Kel said, not flinching, "but the ones that survive are worse. Every time one of them falls, the rest grow angrier. They don't just fight because they have to, they fight because they want to. It's not about winning to them. It's about surviving long enough to make the enemy regret the day they ever crossed paths with humanity." General Tran opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. He was a seasoned fighter, and there was something in Kel's words that made him uneasy. "I've heard of human soldiers carrying on in hopeless situations," Tran said, "but I still don't see how that's worse than 1,000 species capable of transforming their environment, controlling minds, or outright altering the course of time." "It's not worse," Kel said slowly, measuring each word. "It's just different, more irritating than terrifying if you're on the other side. They don't know when to give up. That's their biggest advantage. They'll fight, lose, then fight again with even more fury. That's what breaks your spirit." Tran growled, feeling the weight of Kel's words for the first time. He had once been part of a fleet that wiped out entire worlds in mere days, but he had never fought anyone like this before. He had heard the stories. Humans would fight to the last man, sometimes even after their last man was long dead. He had chalked it up to legends, exaggerations born from terror. But now, standing face to face with Kel, he wondered if they were true. The crew was silent for a long time. Then Kel spoke again, quieter this time. "I've seen it firsthand. The Terran army during the First United Earth War. The coalition had us all cornered. We were sure we'd wipe them out, and for a while, it seemed like we were winning." He paused, his expression unreadable. "Then they came back with a vengeance, and every time that HFY came back, they were a little more vicious, a little more desperate, a little more determined. You'd think that after losing so many, they'd break. They never did." Tran exhaled sharply through his nostrils. "Sounds like you admire them." "Don't mistake me," Kel said quickly, his eyes sharp as he turned back to the view screen. I'm not saying they're superior. They're not. But there's a reason every empire that's ever gone up against them ends up paying the price. And it's not just because of their strength, their strategy, or their tactics. It's because they're relentless. The crew remained still, digesting the weight of his words. Kel's fingers twitched against the console. If you don't believe me, I'll tell you one more thing. A story about a battle on Earth during their Second World War. A small group of human soldiers, less than 50, were trapped behind enemy lines. They had no weapons, no supplies. The enemy was closing in, ready to wipe them out completely. The general shifted in his seat, intrigued despite himself. The human soldiers fought and fought and fought. Even when they had nothing left but their hands and teeth, they kept fighting. Not to win, not to survive, but to kill enough of their enemy that their deaths would be worth something. When the reinforcements finally arrived, they found those men completely wiped out, every last one. But not before they'd taken down 500 of the enemy. 500, General. And they weren't even armed. The room was still again. No one spoke. Everyone knew it was true, because if it wasn't, it would be the one story that didn't seem possible. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, before Tran finally spoke, his voice laced with something resembling suspicion. And you think we're afraid of this? This human relentlessness? Kel's lips curled into a tight, almost sardonic smile. Not afraid, but I wouldn't underestimate it. You've heard of the Terran siege of Chiron, right? A low murmur passed through the crew. The siege of Chiron had been a galactic spectacle, a legendary defense of an outpost that had lasted far longer than anyone could have anticipated or even hoped. The combined forces of the Coalition, the Sark Dominion, and the Thalhar Hive had surrounded the human base on Chiron 4, expecting a quick victory. Instead, the Terran had fought back with such ferocity that the siege lasted 3 full years. 3 years of constant bombardment, resource depletion, and wave after wave of failed assault. Kel continued. You see, the Terran didn't win because they had better weapons or because their technology was superior. No, they won because they just would not stop. For 3 years, they repelled every attack, and every time you thought you had them cornered, they would crawl out from the wreckage and keep fighting. I was stationed there, and I saw it. I saw entire battalions of Sark soldiers wiped out by single human squads that had been abandoned to die. That sounds like exaggeration, General Tran sneered. The SARs are no slouches. Tell that to the Sark fleet, Kel replied coolly, his eyes never leaving the general. The same fleet that, after 3 years of siege, had to pull back because their own supply lines had been wiped out. Do you think that was a coincidence? The crew members shifted uncomfortably. It was one thing to hear stories about human perseverance, but it was another to hear about it from someone who had witnessed it firsthand. Kel's words seemed to carry a weight that made them uneasy, like the crackling energy before a storm. Humans don't fight to win, Kel said, his voice colder now. They fight to make sure you lose. Tran rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, the scales on his face shifting under the pressure. And yet I've seen hundreds of human fleets crushed, countless soldiers wiped out in a single battle. You're telling me their relentlessness makes up for all that? Don't mistake their loss for defeat, Kel said softly. The Terran are a species of survivors, not conquerors. They don't fight to win a war in the traditional sense. They fight to survive, and when they survive long enough, they'll outlast you. There was a long pause. Outside, the debris from the destroyed enemy fleet still drifted through the void. The silence on the bridge added a strange reverence to the scene. Even the harsh artificial lights overhead seemed muted, as if they were trying to give Kel's words time to settle in. General Tran leaned forward. What makes them so relentless, though? Why not just give up? Why not flee like every other species would? Kel hesitated for a moment before responding, his voice almost thoughtful. Because they believe they'll win, even when they have no reason to. And when you've fought long enough and bled enough, you start believing it too. The general let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated in his throat. You make them sound like gods. But they're not gods, Kel nodded, a slight smile on his lips. Exactly. They're just men. But they've learned to fight like nothing else in the galaxy because they know one thing that no other species understands. And what's that? Tran asked, raising an eyebrow. That war isn't won by the strongest or the most clever or the most technologically advanced. It's won by those who can endure the longest. And humans, for all their flaws, endure like no other. Tran narrowed his eyes, still unconvinced. You're asking me to believe that there's some sort of unstoppable force because they're stubborn? They're not just stubborn, General. They're obsessed. They'll fight, lose, and fight again because they are not fighting for themselves anymore. They're fighting for the ones who came before them and for the ones who will come after. The silence that followed was heavy. Each member of the bridge crew digested the unsettling truth in Kel's words. The room felt colder now, the weight of inevitability hanging in the air. The image of the Terran soldier, that relentless force that never knew when to stop, began to take shape in their minds, not as some abstract concept, but as something more terrifying than any fleet or weapon they had ever faced. They'll fight until they die, Kel muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And then they'll fight beyond that. Tran was silent for a long time. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the ship's systems, as if they too were considering Kel's ominous words. The general's mind raced, the pieces of strategy and conquest slowly assembling into a picture he hadn't expected. This wasn't a war like any other. How do you beat something like that? Tran asked finally, the question more to himself than Kel. Kel smiled again, but this time it wasn't a look of amusement. It was something else, something dangerous. You don't. You just make them suffer long enough that they can't endure anymore. The general stiffened. And how do we do that? We don't, Kel replied simply. He turned back to the viewing screen, his voice almost resigned. That's why I left them. Because I couldn't.